in the 1950s, when I was a teenager and before and while I was going to high school, I got to know Winslow Herrick personally from Herrick's store, because I lived about half a mile from that store, and I was in his store hundreds and hundreds of times during that period of time. And so every time I'd walk into the store, Winslow would always talk to me and say hello. And in particular, when I started running track at Brewer, if something were in the Bangor Daily News that I'd won a race or something, he would personally congratulate me. And it's just fantastic. I was a young kid, and I got to know him in that regard. But I knew him as the owner of Herrick's store, and that was it. And he did tell one story to me at one point, which was, I think after I'd won a race, he said, well, I ran a mile race one time, and I got second. And I said, wow, that's great. He says, of course, there were only 2 runners in the race, which I was shocked. I mean, I didn't understand what he was talking about at the time, but when we started doing the research later on, I found out he was a great athlete, and he was a really outstanding track man at Brewer and the University of Maine. And I was stunned because, he would just joke about it. He was very modest. My brother used to work for him when he was in high school as well. And I asked him recently about, what do you think about Winslow, and what kind of a personality was he? And all he could say was he was a fantastic guy, he had a great sense of humor, kind of quiet sometimes, but great businessman, very modest. So, those kinds of things I remember to this day. And but also did some more research about the kind of thing where he was, I don't know, I'm talking about my grandparents, and that you probably don't have to use that, but they lived probably a half a mile from Herrick's store, and my grandfather in the wintertime would go out to the woods. He ended up being a supervisor at the mill, and he'd go away for 2 or 3 months, go into the northern Maine woods to cut trees and stuff for the various companies, and to make the money for the family. And during that time, my grandmother ran a tab at Herrick's store. She didn't have the money to pay for the food, but it turns out he did that a lot with people in South Brewer and Orrington, because it was sort of like that was the major business there. And you did your grocery shopping at Herrick's store. I mean, there were no Hannafords or Shaws or Stop and Shop. There was Herrick's in South Brewer, and you relied on them. The other thing I figured out was he took care of people. Whether most of the people who 100 years ago who lived in South Brewer and Orrington were either immigrants or their parents were immigrants. Most of them had come from Canada, New Brunswick and Quebec. And the whole community in South Brewer was exactly what that was. And Herrick's was right at the center of it. Somebody had made the comment, some research that I had done, that they talked about the whole issue of the focal points of South Brewer and Orrington, and those focal points were school, the sawmill, church, and Herrick's store. I mean, that's what people focused on. So once I learned that, I appreciated Winslow's ability over time, and all the stuff about his track stuff at Brewer and the University of Maine, but he was a quality guy. During the Depression years in World War II, because people didn't have jobs, and the mill was kind of the central point that people did have jobs in the mill, and Winslow's importance and Herrick's importance in that community during the Depression was incredible. and his reputation was spectacular. And he allowed people to charge the groceries, and people were running tabs. And I'll guarantee you, he didn't get paid back in many cases. But he handled that. He knew he wasn't going to get paid back. So, and again, that's. And maybe there are other organizations in Bangor and Brewer that did similar things. I'm just not aware of it, but he certainly did, and that's one of the ways his reputation was created. The yearbook quote at the University of Maine, and I'll read it. Underneath it, I don't know if it was in his name or whether or not it was just one of an article, and the quote was, "We're off in a gale of wind with this unconscious one-man track team from Brewer." And that was kind of like the parting shot of Winslow Herrick at the University of Maine. So he was very well known at the university, and was probably one of the first athletes in Brewer high school history who got that kind of notoriety. Again, 30 years later, 40 years in, nobody knew anything about it. It was like it was done. We figured that out. So, and the other thing is that his brother Carlton was a track man at the University of Maine before Winslow even got there, and his son John was a two-time state mile champion in 1952 and 1953, and I think you had mentioned that he's still in the top 20 of the mile, in the 4:37 or something like that. So quite a family, and they were very impressive.